Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to our Facebook Live session this morning. I am joined by my colleagues from the New Hampshire Department of Education at the Bureau of Student Wellness, and we're here this morning to talk about grit. I'm going to give people just a minute to get the Facebook Live notification and to join the chat. And while I do that, I want to remind everybody you can find our posts on social media like Twitter, on Facebook, and I want to encourage everybody to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We typically go live there in the afternoon at 3 p.m. And if you hit the bell notification there, you'll get notified, a push notification every time we go live, so you don't miss these awesome chats. So this morning, like I said, we are here to talk about grit, and it is a word that's been around for a while. But the idea of grit in education is something that really took shape after Angela Duckworth released a New York Times bestselling book called Grit, The Power and Passion of Perseverance. And she also gave a TED Talk about it. And when we get going, I'm going to share the link to the TED Talk so you guys can check it out yourselves as well. But Angela Duckworth essentially found through her research that grit was a greater predictor of graduation than things like family income, standardized achievement, IQ, how safe kids feel at school. And so she really wanted to dig into what grit was. And so she decided, or she kind of found grit to be not only perseverance for a long time, but passion as well. And I think passion's a really important part of grit. It's not just being able to muscle through something, but to be motivated and passionate about what you're working on. Having stamina and sticking through the future, not just thinking about like weeks at a time, but year-long goals. And Angela Duckworth closed by really recognizing that she stated she's not an expert on building grit. And she recognizes that, you know, we all kind of share this grittiness together. So she wanted everybody to think about how we can be gritty to help our kids get grittier. So essentially looking to test our ideas about grit and see whether or not they're successful and learn from those to kind of build out as a team what grit means, or as a set of colleagues. So I'm here with my colleagues. I have Lisa Hayward, Susan Ward, and Catherine Lesswing from the New Hampshire Department of Education. And we're here to kind of practice that, to think through grit and what it means for us and our experiences. So I want to open up the table to you guys to talk about grit.
When you're thinking of grit and you're thinking about your experiences, would you say that you have grit? And if so, how has it helped you?
Oh, that's a good question, Susan. Just as a disclaimer, I'd heard of the word grit, but not necessarily in this context before Angela Duckworth's it was really her TED Talk that I saw first came out. And that was the first time I sat back and thought, do I have grit or not? And I would say that, yes, I definitely do. And I'm not sure why. And I think that might be why, or might be the case for a lot of people. I just can remember being very young when my father first took the training wheels off my bike and just being out there all day long until I could ride the bike without, falling over. And when I look back on that memory, I think, what was it that I really wanted to achieve? And I still to this day don't know if that was an intrinsic thing or if it was I wanted to please my father. So I would say that mindset though has really carried throughout. And the piece about passion for me is really a big piece. I am very passionate about a whole bunch of topics, and I think that I did learn that from a parent, and so that might have contributed to my desire to explore. But how it's helped me in my life, I think, just every step of the way, want to achieve the goal. And I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit later. When goals or desired outcomes aren't met, how do we handle that? And do we dust ourselves off and get back up? I don't generally deal very well with failure. I tend to, wallow in it a little bit, and eventually I'll come out the other side, but it's hard for me. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me. I think it's helped, but I think it's also kind of led to some fear of making mistakes in a way.
Mm.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Molly, for the really nice introduction about what grit is. When I listen to you talk, I think sometimes I'm gritty and sometimes I'm not gritty at all. And when I reflect about times when I've experienced grit, they've been moments that I felt passionate about. So like Catherine explained, the need or the want to ride her bike without the training wheels. And when I apply that memory, when I'm in a situation where something triggers the need for me to be grittier than I might be feeling, I think back and I remember, oh, Lisa, think through that time before when you needed grit and you actually used your grit to get through a difficult situation. How can you harness that gritty feeling now to get you through what you're going through at the moment? So memory is really critical for me in the application of grittiness when I need to be gritty.
That's really interesting that you say that. It just made me think back years ago. I don't even know when it was or what the actual topic was about, but it was like Good Morning America, and they were interviewing this guy, and he was doing some exceptional work. I don't know what it was, but he said what helped him was at night, he posted this sticky note above his bed and so when he woke up every morning, he would read, "Let no one work harder than you today." And he read it before he got out of bed every day. And so last year I was going through a 40-hour internship and tried to also work 40 hours on top of that. And I remember it was very exhausting. And I remember thinking of that note, thinking, should I put one up there? But it was just enough to have that memory to, look at this person who had talked about just that one time where it happened to catch my attention, where he talked about how he motivated himself. And I would think, even though I didn't have it, I would think about that note and would say, all right, let's do it. Let no one work harder than you today. And I also was passionate about the work I was doing too. So that obviously made it a little easier. So, but really interesting. When we talk about and think about grit, it's definitely an excellent topic to dive into.
And thinking about grit, hearing everybody talk, I don't know if it's correct or not, but I'm thinking about working through things. We say we muscle through or we persevere, but sometimes you're working through something that you actually really enjoy. And I'm thinking about our jobs in particular, where we have really long-term goals. A lot of the things we're looking to do in social, emotional, and in this world of multi-tiered systems is a really long-term goal. So I think anybody who partakes in this kind of work to build out wellness for students and for adults and children is inherently gritty. We're working for the long term. So I think we all have grit.
So I have a question for you. What are the benefits of teaching grit to children? And are there ever any times when you see any drawbacks to this?
So I definitely think there are benefits in teaching grit to children or students. When we look at where effort is put and how progress is being made, and how it can kind of be motivation and a catapult to teach them to keep going. And then, at looking at, and when you were talking about failures, Catherine, I started thinking to myself too, sometimes that's such a huge part of growth, and it's okay to fail. Like if we fail, it teaches us how to get back up, brush yourself off, and refocus and say, okay, how do I keep going? And when I look at grit, I think sometimes that does happen. And even though there's that fear of failure, I think it can be just such a great learning experience, because we're all going to fail, right? And sometimes some of the best leaders have failed, tried again, or best inventors have failed, tried again, and then created something so important. And and that's what helps us keep going, right? Is that grit. Like, I failed. I'm not going to just give up. I've got to figure out how I'm going to get up and do this again, even though it's kind of a cruddy feeling.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Susan. And I, as a teacher, I was always thinking, how do I teach this? And I think we'll get into that in a little bit. But I think the benefits are huge to teaching perseverance and how to work through failure for students. No human being is going to be 100% successful all of the time. And so how do you teach how to navigate making mistakes without throwing in the towel for the long haul? Yeah. So I think for me, I love, growth mindset. Angela Duckworth talks a lot about that, and we've talked about it a little bit. Molly had a whole session on it. And, there are ways to incorporate that into the classroom, into the school building. And it's shown that you can really teach students to think differently than I'm getting an A, I'm getting an F, where, and think of it more holistically and think, I'm not quite there yet. That was the thing I took away from your growth mindset talk, Molly, was not being there yet. I will say I personally have a few qualms with teaching grit. I think sometimes it can gloss over some of the trauma experiences or adverse experiences that kids come to school with that just will make it impossible for them in certain situations to persevere. And they just don't have the capacity mentally to really, work through and feel passion. If you think about passion, passion is almost like a luxury of brain functioning. And if you don't have your basic needs met, it's going to be really hard to feel passionate and excited and engaged in something. So I think there is there's a fine line to walk there when we're teaching kids grit. How do we teach them perseverance? And the last thing I'll just say about that, the word itself, grit, to me connotes somewhat like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's a little bit individualistic, just get up and dust yourself off. And
I think you might be a little frozen.
Yeah, I think, Catherine, you might have frozen a little bit.
Make sure that we're...
There you go, you're back.
You can take it away. That's probably the sign from the universe that I've spoken too long.
Well, actually, it's funny because you were kind of right in a line what I was going to say. You were talking about pulling yourself off and dusting yourself off by your bootstraps. And it's funny, when I was a teacher, one way as a school we kind of decided to teach grit was talking like a physical brush yourself off when you have to work through something. I worked with really young kiddos, and so when they were really trying to persevere or had to work through something challenging and they were getting upset about it, we told them to brush it off, which I liked and didn't like at the same time. So I think it's kind of a benefit and a drawback, because for some kiddos it worked great. That was enough of a reminder to persevere. They're like, yep, I can brush this off, I can move on, and I can work through. But like Catherine was saying, with some of those other kids, they just weren't there, they weren't ready for that. And I think that's part of the balance of teaching kids grit, is recognizing when they're ready and when they also need a little more support, some of that more receptive language and talking through what it is they're working through.
And Molly, as you were talking about that, I was thinking how cool it would be for a school maybe to have a scale almost, like where 3 is like, I feel like I can dust myself off. 2 is I'm still a little sad, or, whatever it is. And 1 is I really need some support right now.
That's a great idea.
So just for me to close my question, I think it's important that we teach our children and also ourselves, and we give ourselves permission to ask for help when we need it, that we can't always have grit in every situation. And that if we feel that we should be gritty, I would be concerned that some children might internalize a sense of shame if they're not being gritty, when really they should be reaching out to ask for help or support.
Nail on the head. So true.
Yeah, so I think that leads us to our last question, which is how do you talk about or teach grit to students or children? I know all of us have had experience in education, so what have been some successes you've had, or how did you approach the topic?
So I think just letting children know that they can be gritty and that they don't have to be gritty and that they should be self-reflective. I mean, of course, a lot of this is developmentally appropriate language for them. So very much kind of summing up everything that we've said, introducing children to the concept of grit, but also letting them know that they don't have to have grit all the time in every situation, and to be self-aware. And of course, the older the child is, the more they can be self-reflective on that.
Absolutely. I agree with you, Lisa. And I think in teaching students about grit, those that are a little bit older, taking a page from Carol Dweck's book in Growth Mindset, teaching them about brain development, and that you really can learn a skill and build your brain and increase, your abilities that way as well. I think it's really powerful in empowering students to learn about their own internal bodies and how they can grow their brain to grow their abilities.
Yeah, I think you're right too. Definitely encouraging students to, well, teaching grit, encouraging students to use it, and at the same time having that empathy for when they can't, and knowing and being able to really kind of identify when they're struggling and let them know, yeah, it's okay. And sometimes you're going to need help. Sometimes you're going to ask for help, and just make sure you do. You don't always have to have it right or have it figured out all of the time, and that's okay.
Yeah, I love all of those thoughts and reflections. I think one thing I keep coming back to is the passion piece, and
Mm.
in the school I was teaching at, some students, I think this is probably pretty common, students come to class, especially as adolescents, and, oh, this is boring, I'm not really interested in anything. And how do you tap into that passion, even when it's not your subject area? And I think passion is something that we can really model for students, and getting excited about the world and opportunities. And it's one of those emotions that's almost contagious. And kind of just going back to that very first memory I talked about this morning, the riding the bike piece. My father was an extremely passionate person, and a lot of my interests really stem from things that he shared with me. So I think that that's something that we can think about when we're in education, helping students really find the subjects that they're excited about and the things that they want to pursue in life. Any last thoughts or comments before we wrap up here? All right. Well,
I would just
no,
I would
go ahead.
just say that when we teach grit and we teach the self-reflective process, it's also worth considering to teach children how to recognize in their peers when they're struggling and when they need help. So when do you encourage someone to have grit? And then when do you reach out and say, hey, I'm here to help you?
That's a great point. Yeah, and I think if I am taking anything away from this conversation that we've had today, it's about striking that balance between teaching the skills of developing a growth mindset, while also providing the supports when students really need it. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in today. We will be back here live this afternoon for a really special session with Dr. Cassie Yackley called Conscious Evolution, the Critical Role of Reflective Practice in Post-Crisis Actions. Her sessions are always really engaging, so we hope you'll tune into that. That's at 3 p.m. on YouTube. And then just be sure to follow us on our different social media channels. If you'd like to get our newsletter, you can find it at nhlearnsremotely.org/contact. And we hope that you all have a wonderful morning. Thank you again for joining us today, ladies.
Thank you.
you.